You know how many counsellors it takes to change a light bulb? The light bulb has to want to change. Grief is a fairly heavy topic, even without delving into your own emotional processes or your own experiences around grief. It is still heavy. So thank you for following me, staying with me this morning. This next half an hour, which is what I have left, we'll try to look at, well, what do we do with this? This is the situation. It is confronting. There's a lot of change, and there's change stacked upon change in your organisation. Some people are leaving, are being made redundant. Decisions are being made that not perhaps everyone is happy with, and maybe they're very necessary under the circumstances. There's not a lot of space to process change. Some people love change. Some people are change junkies. They live for change. Other people, change is a really confronting, scary thing, and they need a lot of time to process it. So even your own preference when it comes to change is a factor in this landscape. So what helps? Well, these are a few of my ideas, and hopefully it'll give you a springboard to think about. Number one, if I feel at sea a little untethered by what's happening in this organisation at the moment, if it's impacting my well-being, in particular if it's creating grief and loss, then you can ask yourself, what are my possibilities? What are my options when it comes to caring for yourself? In supervision, I tell people who are in any kind of helping role, whether it's counsellors, community workers, clergy, that's your instrument. I built a house a few years ago as an owner builder in Yass. And I was introduced to all these amazing tools that chippies or carpenters use. It was quite an education. Mind you, I didn't use a lot of them because I was scared of cutting my finger off. But in our field, where the work is emotional, where it's spiritual, where it's intersubjective, our tools aren't so obvious, are they? When we sit with people and have pastoral conversations, the tools that we use, they're not in front of us, they're up here or in here or down there. And so for you to be able to use those tools well, you have to be well as a person. Who you are is your instrument in this work. And so I see well-being as essential to your ability to be able to conduct your role. Of course, there are things that organisations can do, and I've labelled that because I think it's a shared responsibility. In an ideal world, it's a collaborative approach where organisations can say, we are implementing a bucket load of change here at a rapid pace. What can we do to assist people cope with this kind of scenario? And there's all sorts of things that organisations can do, but I just wanted to flag that. And then there's leadership, and I'm not talking about upper level leadership, I'm talking about mid-range leadership, because I think that level of leadership, they are in a very unique position. And I like people such as Simon Sinek, such as Brene Brown, who talk about a particular type of leadership. And that is one that is relationship-based and person-centred. Where, yes, there are hard decisions to be made and there are things that just have to happen, things that we don't like that are out of our control, but people, their hearts, their well-being, their emotional health is essential. I want to give you an example of this. After leaving the Salvos, because I've worked for Uniting Care, I've worked for the Seventh-day Adventist, I've worked for the Salvos, so I thought I'd better change it up, and I worked for the Baptist. So I worked for the Baptist for 3 years, and my line manager was someone that I know quite well. And he said, to be able to have the communication is important. And I want to be honest with you as much as I can. And so if anything changes or looks like it's changing on the horizon, I'll find a way of communicating that with you. And sure enough, we had lots of discussions about organisational restructures and change, because Baptist Care has been through their fair share. And sure enough, another wave of change was coming along. And he sat down and said to me, I can't tell you all the details, but I want you to know that in the near to medium future, there might be a change in leadership in my position and I may not be your boss. He couldn't tell me all the details, and later I learnt all the background to that and the reason for that change. But what I really appreciated was the fact that he flagged that with me. He told me as much as he could, as early as he could. Okay? And then he just kept filling in the details as we went along. I still grieved. I really liked working with him, and I miss our conversations and our catch-ups and our coffee in places like Wagga and Goulburn and all over the state. I still grieve not being able to work alongside of him, but the transition perhaps wasn't as bumpy as it could have been if he hadn't taken the risk of letting me know what was happening out of concern for my well-being. What everyone has in common is that no matter how they grieve, they share a need for their grief to be witnessed. That doesn't mean needing someone to try to lessen it or reframe it for them. The need is for someone to be fully present to the magnitude of their loss without trying to point out the silver lining. And that's a hard thing to do. It's a really, really difficult thing to do, to sit with someone and hear about the messiness they're in with their grief or trauma or stress or change, and not try and fix it. There's something inside of us that wants to make it better, and that comes out of a good place, right? That comes out of wanting to help the person feel better. But paradoxically, that doesn't work too well. We're better to listen first. And if you do that, not always, but sometimes people can identify their own silver lining. Yes, in the midst of this upheaval and change, it would be great if organisations could be sensitive and aware and tuned in, but organisations are big creatures, are big beasts, and sometimes that doesn't happen. So it comes back to us. It is our well-being, it is our emotional health, it is our mental health that is on the line. So it does come back to us to make some decisions. I don't mean that we should do that alone. I believe that people thrive in communities, people thrive in relationships, and the best way for people to experience healing, to build resilience, to find recovery is through relationships. At the same time, the responsibility for our well-being lies with us. And in that mental state of survival mode, it is very difficult to reflect and to gauge where you're up to and what you need. That is a tricky part, because people get into that survival mode and they're on that treadmill and they're just trying to live moment to moment. They're not registering what is happening to them at a deeper level. They are not registering the impact or the toll that is taking. So this is a tricky task, because it requires you to step out of that rut. It requires you to step off that treadmill, then to be able to examine where you're up to reflect what you need. And sometimes we can only do that in conversations with others. Sometimes it is all so foggy in our heads that we cannot sort it out internally. We need to talk it out with someone and pull it apart and find out what is happening for us, what is missing, and what is going to put us back together. A couple of points there, that self-reflection and the naming and the taming. When we can name what's happening for us, if we can call it grief, if we can call it long-term exhaustion. What I've noticed among many people who are in the welfare, pastoral care area is they reach a point of emotional poverty. They are giving so much. They're holding so much from other people, the trauma, the grief, the loss, that they are dry themselves emotionally. And they know the theory, and even this has happened to me, I know the theory, I know what needs to happen for self-care, but it's just hard to do. It feels like such a big step to take, nearly impossible. This is where you need the level of honesty with yourself. When you can stop and say, I am really struggling. Where you can put your hand up and say, I'm not coping, that's the truth. This is too much for me, I'm actually sinking. That's a scary thing to say, I know. It's a very difficult thing to say, but it's a healthy thing to say. And I'm not suggesting you stay in that place, then you can take steps, but to acknowledge it is the first step. With that fierce honesty, you can gauge where you're up to and then react accordingly. When it comes to grief, Mal McKissock talks about the 3 T's: time, tears and talk. Lots of times you hear people say time will fix it, and time does help for a lot of processes. You build your life, remember, around that loss, and time does that. But sometimes there are elements of the loss that are confusing, that are bewildering, that are incomprehensible, and that's where you need someone to talk to. That's where you need to talk it out. So the 3 T's for grieving. And of course, a shameless plug for my field. I think counselling is a helpful strategy. It's not always easy to talk to families and friends, and some of us have great friends, some of us have great family who will listen. But when I talk to clients, they say, I don't want that relationship to change. I want my partner to be my partner. I want my friend to be my friend. I don't want to share all this distressing stuff with them. So sometimes people will get support from counselling. And supervision, don't wait till you're on the edge of exhaustion or burnout. Supervision is an excellent mechanism for monitoring your well-being and monitoring your work. Okay, Lunig is one of my favourites when it comes to expressing things in this domain, expressing the truths that may lay in this domain. This is a prayer I often give to clients. Let it go, let it out, let it all unravel, let it free, and it can be a path upon which to travel. There is something cathartic, there is also something healing by being able to externalise our experience. We're not holding it inside where it ruminates, where it just circulates around and cannot find any exit, cannot find any expression, or cannot find any peace. If we can let it go, and that can be a metaphorical task, giving it to God or just releasing it emotionally. If we can let it go, if we can put it out there, give it to God, it actually folds back into our journey. It enriches us somehow. It deepens us somehow. So it doesn't eat away inside of us, it nearly becomes part of our compass. So what can you do? If you're feeling burdened, if you're feeling in that rut, if you're feeling like, yes, I am struggling to stay upright, that all these changes and all the losses, the decisions that perhaps you may not completely understand or agree with, and then we'll put on top of that any personal stuff you've got going on, whether that's just everyday garden variety stresses or changes happening in your family structure or your physical health, whatever it might be. If you pour them all in together and stack them on top of one another, it can become very sizable. And remember, being a country boy, I like some metaphors from that area of the world. And in the country, you don't always have town water. Sometimes you have to rely on rainwater and tanks. Now, I talk to people about their capacity tank, their emotional tank, their spiritual tank. You can call it whatever you want, but it's that energy, that internal resources that allow people to do their job, to keep moving forward in their life, to deal with issues. I say there is a tap at the bottom. And if you're giving out at work, if you're giving out to your kids or your family, or if you're supporting older parents, if you are stressed, if you are grieving, that tap is open. And a quantity of your resources is coming out of that tap, is leaving you. And yes, you can turn that tap off to stop that outflow, but that's not realistic. Most of us have demands in our life. What is a more balanced and productive thing to do is look at the inlet. What is life-giving in your life? What feeds into you as a person? What revitalises you? What restores you? What re-energises you? And I cannot tell you that because it's so individual. Like our expressions of loss, the uniqueness in us means that we have to find our own way of filling ourselves, refilling ourselves. And often it's only simple things. Catching up with someone for a coffee. Or it might be going for a walk along the beach, going for a walk in the bush. It might be spending time with a dog. Could be a million different things, but you need to know what they are. And what I've set up there is what realigns you. What allows you to just breathe into yourself. What allows you to feel like you're connected internally. All those opposites to being stressed. And then be intentional about that. You cannot squeeze those sort of things in at the end of the day when you're exactly exhausted. You cannot squeeze them into 5 minutes as an afterthought on a Monday afternoon. You need to be disciplined in terms of how you carve out time for that. And I know when you're under pressure in survival mode, there's a part in your head that says that you cannot afford to do that. It says you don't have that luxury, that it's not really a priority. And that is a risky way to talk to yourself. One of my favourite shows is Seinfeld, and I really appreciate Seinfeld's humour, though I know it's not everyone's taste. I think a sense of humour is vital to one's well-being, but that's my point of view. I think it helps us deal with the absurd. Physiologically, it changes our body and all the chemicals in our body when we can laugh. And so having a way to giggle or to laugh, and beyond that to be playful, whether that's taking your grandkid to the park or playing with your dog, whatever it might be, have a way to be playful, because that is very restorative. Creative outlets. I tell my clients, because I have a whiteboard and occasionally I draw things on it, I say, I am not a good artist at all. In fact, it would be hard to even recognise my stick figures. So I have an appreciation for art, but I'm not necessarily good at it. I love music. Creative outlets, once again, are a great way to restore our heart and our emotions. Of course, faith, this is a tricky one, because often when people get exhausted, when people are doing God's work, remember our lives aren't completely compartmentalised, everything mixes with one another, that people's faith can take a bruising. So if you notice that your spirituality is dry, that is another sign that you are probably suffering emotionally. I think it was Jung that said the emotions are the gateway to the spirit world, to our connection with God. So that they interplay very closely. And maybe you need to revisit your faith. Maybe you need to find ways of re-examining it or revitalising it. We are people that have to make meaning of our world. That is our ability as human beings. And I think it was a theologian, I don't know whether he's written any books, but his name's McAdams, and he talks about two different types of narratives. He talks about the redemptive narrative and the contemplative narrative. And I actually got this information from a TED talk called The Power of Meaning, Crafting a Life That Matters, from Emily Smith. But I like this comparison, because what McAdams found is some people have been through some awful losses. They've been through some traumatic events. Life had really knocked them. Terrible things. But somehow they still had a positive view of life. Somehow they come out the other side and were still hopeful. Doesn't mean that it wasn't challenging and confronting and they didn't grieve deeply, or they weren't affected by trauma. But they still maintained a hopeful, positive outlook on life. And he found that when he talked to these people, they had created redemptive narratives. So they could say, yes, that was horrible. They could be honest about what they went through, what they lost, the trauma, the impact. But they could still find some way of being hopeful on the other side of that, or a thread of hope or faith through these stories. And he found that those people obviously were much more settled in life, had greater well-being, whereas people that had a contamination narrative, which is understandable, they got lost in those experiences. They got caught in those experiences, and those experiences continued to define the way they see the world and their whole life. They weren't able to find a redemptive framework for what they had been through. I don't judge those people, because if I had been through some of the experiences they had, I'm not sure that I could find a redemptive one either. But I like the idea that we have the capacity within us, and that is really the Christian story, isn't it? We have the capacity within us to receive, to reflect, to create redemptive mechanisms, redemptive narratives in ourselves and in the lives of others. So this is kind of stepping out of grief and loss a little bit, and it's a piece of advice I often give supervisees. When you're in a sticky situation, this guy called Russ Harris says you have a number of options. You can leave the situation, which is quite legitimate. You can stay and change what can be changed, or you stay and accept what can't be changed and live by your values, or you can stay and give up trying and do the things that make the situation worse. So really, even in all this tumultuous environment, we have agency. We have the ability to look after ourselves, make that a priority, and be ruthless about that. Do not compromise on your well-being. And we also have choice. We have choice over how we are going to react to this situation. We don't have choice around a lot of the things that have created this environment. but we have the ability to acknowledge the impact. We have the ability to grieve. We have the ability to voice and to verbalise our experience. And then we can make choices. So yes, organisational change, it's time for me to tie up, but organisational change is bruising. And when you have chapter upon chapter upon chapter, people can become exhausted. They become burnt out from change and they can nearly develop a sense of hopelessness or helplessness. It's not only difficult to grieve, it's just difficult to make sense of what's happening. There's not even really the space to grieve. And sometimes there are not the mechanisms. There are not the conversation spaces to reflect on what's going on. And for me, that's essential. You need to make places where you can reflect, where you can come out of that hustle and bustle, and then you can connect with what's happening for you. So it is hard, it is challenging, and it is a legitimate form of grieving. And it often piggybacks onto everything else that's going on in your life, other stresses, other losses. But I would encourage you to take stock. I'd encourage you to take stock of where you're up to, where your emotional tank is at the moment, what you need to do. Acknowledge the losses, acknowledge what needs to be grieved even if you cannot grieve it at this point. And then think about what is required to restore yourself or your heart. Because I was a theologian, I did spend $40,000 on getting a degree at one point. I thought I'd better include one text. Psalm 147 verse 3. He heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds. Okay, there are some resources that I've also included. Mal McKissock, Coping with Grief, is the best, most basic resource if people are struggling with grief. And there are some websites there. Grief.org.au, the Australian Centre for Grief and Bereavement, is a helpful one. If you are looking for supervision, if you are looking to recommend a counsellor for relationship counselling, individual counselling, family counselling, please consider my service. I also do Prepare and Enrich, and a large part of my work is taken up with supervision. So ministry supervision from clergy from different denominations, professional supervision. I've supervised money care workers, NILS workers, youth workers, youth refuge workers, and all sorts of counsellors as well. I do group and individual. I also do this type of thing occasionally, presentations and debriefing for churches and teams. So thank you for allowing me to spend the morning with you.